Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on your time zone. I am Lígia Ferro, as a Vice President and Conference Chair. I would like to welcome you to the second plenary session of ESA 2021 conference. Today, we will be discussing sociological knowledges for alternative futures, migrations, and transnationalism. Migrations and forced migrations are at the global agenda as an important challenge of our times, even more now that we are facing a pandemic. The ESA Executive Committee organized this plenary session with the goal of broadening the discussion within the sociological community on this issue. And for that, we decided to invite 3 researchers with outstanding trajectories in this field. Firstly, we will listen to the speech by Professor Rosamaria Cisneros. She is assistant professor at the Coventry University in the United Kingdom, a Roma sociologist, curator, dance historian, and critic, a Romani scholar, and peace activist. I would like to highlight that ESA is presenting for the first time in its history a Roma sociologist as plenary speaker. Her experience as researcher and activist will bring very fresh data to this session. Secondly, we will hear Professor Mokhtar El Harras from University Mohammed in Morocco. He is a professor of sociology and also a member of the board of the Arabic Council for the Social Sciences, has been publishing numerous articles and book chapters on international and transnational migration. Finally, Professor Thomas Faist from the University of Bielefeld, Germany, will deliver his speech before the discussion, because we will have some time for discussion in the end. Thomas Faist has contributed to ongoing debates about citizenship, transnationality, migration, and social policy in Europe and beyond. On behalf of the ESA Executive Committee, I would like to thank all the speakers who accepted to share their research with us at this interesting plenary session. We will have space for discussion, as I said, so please, if you have any questions or comments, feel free to contribute. And now I will give the floor to Professor Rosamaria Cisneros. She graduated from the University of Wisconsin Madison and got a master's degree in dance history and criticism. She also has a minor in curriculum and instruction from the University of New Mexico in Albuquerque. She earned her doctorate in sociology from the University of Barcelona. The PhD, entitled Transferability of Successful Educational Actions of the Roma Women to the Plural European Contexts, placed the Romani Women's Association, Drom Kotar Mestipen, at the center of this academic investigation. Cisneros was and is involved in various EU-funded projects from framework programs of research. Related to them, she spoke in the headquarters of the European Parliament. She sits on several boards, such as the Roma Coventry Project, GRT Police Association, Drom Kotar Mestipen Romani Association of Women in Spain. She's also a research fellow. She was also a research fellow at Coventry University in the UK. So now, Professor Rosamaria Cisneros, the floor is yours. It is a pleasure to hear you.
Thank you. Thank you to all of the ESA organizers and to the rest of the panel, the tech team. Thank you to all. And most importantly, thank you to all of the people that have supported in getting me here, including the other Roma women and Roma families. And I sit alongside them today. So thank you very much for having me. Now I will share my screen and begin. Hopefully you can see it, yes? Hello, yes, thank you. So yes, my name is Rosamaria Kostic Cisneros, and I sit here today as a Roma woman, as has been highlighted, but particularly as a sociologist. And The title of my talk is Unfolding Human Agency, the Case of Grassroots Roma Women. The EU recognizes that Roma is the most marginalized cultural community in Europe. The Roma issues are also situated at the periphery, even in the scientific studies about cultural groups. Furthermore, Romani women are marginalized even in women and gender studies. The result are opaque lenses that prevent science and society from seeing the deep transformations that the Roma feminist movements are creating in their community and in society. The worst consequence is that science and society are full of racist and sexist stereotypes about us. Romani feminism is one of the most important forces of transformation that has taken place in Europe in the last 3 decades. After centuries of being double or even triple discriminated and silenced, Roma women we have been raising our voice, our concerns, and creating our own spaces and discourses, challenging long-standing prejudices and stereotypes. Grassroots associations like the Mokhtar located in Barcelona, Spain, are just examples of how non-academic Romani women are getting organized, unfolding the full potential of human agency, and transforming many oppressive structures, for instance, through the Roma Women Revolutionary International Congresses, which I will reference later in the talk. Amidst this context, new masculinities are an emerging field of study. An action led by many Roma men who are walking side by side with women to fight against any type of violence or subordination. Taking these analyses into consideration, I will argue how the advancement of sociological theory, and most particularly sociology of gender, could be much benefited acknowledging these new and unexplored real utopias. This presentation will be divided into 3 parts. The first will briefly outline what is already known, highlighting that the EU recognizes the current Roma reality of anti-Gypsyism. I will also reflect on the scientific evidence that exists and focus on 2 examples. One example is the new masculinities, and the second example is Roma feminism. There are approximately 10 to 12 million Roma living in Europe today, and the history of the kaleidoscope of groups that fall under the term Roma is debated throughout various social, academic, political, and artistic circles. Disputing their history and discussing the merits or demerits of the fluid terms used throughout history is beyond the scope of this work. What is central to this discussion is that anti-Gypsyism is real, and here we see that the EU Roma Strategic Framework has now been extended from 2020 to 2030. We know that anti-Gypsyism is a reality. We know the effects that anti-Gypsyism has on society. Roma issues have become controversial topics in European discourse, especially in academia and political groups. Despite the last 2 decades seeing an increase in funneling resources towards the Romani community, there are still gaps in the history and in the way that information is collected, analyzed, and disseminated. As Figure 1 showed, the fundamental rights of agency from the European Commission has said that despite ambitious initiatives, the fundamental rights situation of Roma in Europe remains profoundly troubling. This report examines persisting phenomenon of anti-Gypsyism and its effect on Roma inclusion efforts. It first presents data on key manifestations of anti-Gypsyism, namely discrimination, harassment, and hate crimes. Disenfranchised with this backdrop where EU institutions are claiming this bleak reality that anti-Gypsyism exists and is embedded in society, this perspective highlights the opaque reality that underpins the next portion of my talk. Disenfranchised communities are oftentimes left out of academic spaces, and their social realities are generally interpreted by researchers and/or other professionals. Academic studies have not always considered the voice of the Roma, and particularly Roma women, and excluded this vulnerable group from entering into an honest conversation with the institutions that are leading projects and in positions of power. Exclusionist research on the Roma has basically been conducted using 2 approaches: ethnocentrism and relativism. These methods have maintained the traditional exclusionary power structures which exist within most of academia. According to Fletcher, Gomez, Purtve and Purtvert, there has been a dialogic shift informing several dimensions of society, which in turn affects the way research is carried out. This turn has instigated a series of changes within the scientific world, and sociology of gender is one of the many areas that has been transformed. Realizing Roma Rights, a book by Matachi, Baba, and Mirga, is a key book which offers Roma studies a deep understanding of the human rights dimension affecting the Roma community. The volume brings forward an analysis of the European political developments and outlines the manner that different bodies are treating the Roma topic and have engaged or not engaged with the issues. Darkozy, Koze, Jovanovic, Gemlin, Vajda, and Kurtic in 2018 article explore key aspirations, challenges, and achievements of Roma women's activism through in-depth interviews with 4 leading activists from various countries. While Roma studies scholarship is continuously growing, what is essential to this presentation is exploring the intersections of human agency and the manner that sociology can shift from an opaque lens to an inclusive view where science wins, because we are all carrying out investigations that are not partial. Now we move into these cross-national examples that serve as references for future discussions. The scientific community has started to identify the value of including the Roma community, in particular Roma women, with projects like Brudila Kayi, Kayi Butipen, and Workalo have all been examples where science has benefited from these transparent, egalitarian, and inclusive ways of working. The Workalo project led to the institutional recognition of Roma by the European Union, and on November 21st, 2001, the Roma were internationally recognized by a unanimous vote by the Catalan government. In 2011, Fletcher, Gomez, and Pujvert's communicative methodology underpinned the Included Project, the largest study on school education within the framework program of research of the European Union. Through this egalitarian dialogue, the project was able to collect the demands and concerns of various educational actors, which have later been brought into dialogue with the findings in regard to successful educational actions. This mode of working ensures that the most vulnerable communities, like the Roma, can engage and contribute to the creation of knowledge that lends itself to finding solutions to the social and political problems that the communities face. The cases listed above have considered the positional and reflexivity of both Roma and non-Roma researchers and has critically examined the intersections of Roma and non-Roma community members and researchers. For the last 2 decades, European institutions, civil societies, academic research centers, and government organizations have been focused more on the Roma community. There has been an interest in the Roma's language, traditions, historical knowledge, and everyday behavior. At the time of writing this presentation, Europe finds itself in a tense reality and situation where countries are holding on to traditions and values that are in direct conflict with welcoming the patchwork of the non-European and/or minority communities. Roma within this discourse are often targeted and identified as sources of strain. And to challenge this and to ensure that science wins and we are generating knowledge and understanding between structure and agency, we must change the blueprint to construct the architecture that is inclusive of all voices. Now I move into the cross-national examples that serve as references for this discussion. Example 1, the new masculinities. The Lit Review on studies which are linking the construction of masculinity with the Roma people presents a significant gap. Some studies that address the issue are often reproducing sexist and racist stereotypes about Roma, using occurrences or non-evidence-based argumentation, or making ethnocentric interpretations about Roma voices. Macías Aranda and Redondo Sama show examples of studies articulated in Spain that have made racist and sexist statements about Roma men. One of these is the analysis carried out by Fernández in 1999 and 2006, who argued that Roma boys have great reluctance to accept the orders of non-Roma women, such as teachers, because it goes against their cultural values. In very similar line, there are other studies that analyze the masculinity of Roma boys in the school environments. In their results, they point out that masculinities of Roma boys are related to aspects such as violence, haggling, and sexual comments, generating suspicions and tensions among the teaching community. Among the errors that were found in this analysis is the lack of contrast of these attitudes with those existing in many men and boys who are not Roma. In fact, conceptualizations of hegemonic masculinity developed by Kano already underline that these attitudes are manifested in men of different cultures, origins, and social classes. To contrast this reality, we found recently other studies addressed into the configuration of Roma male identity or into Roma men attitudes to gender equity and against gender violence. In these explorations, young Roma men for generations underlined the importance of the role of Roma men in their dedication to the family, that is, their value of solidarity to improve the quality of life to Roma families. Another component that is pointed out in this study refers to the clear position of Roma men to protect and ensure the well-being of their sons and daughters, especially the latter, to prevent them from being attacked by men representing hegemonic masculinity. Finally, the authors conclude that these young generations of Roma men increasingly publicly show their position for gender equality in their environment. A very recent research carried out in Spain empirically demonstrates that Roma do not accept and/or tolerate gender violence to a greater extent than other men in society, and also demonstrates the clear general position of Roma men in the promotion of gender equality. Therefore, as we already knew, we can affirm that Roma culture is neither more or less sexist than the rest of society. Sexism, inequality, and gender violence exist within the Roma community, just as they exist within the rest of the communities of our society. And now on to example 2 with Romani feminism. To challenge what we see here is an example of a research by Jeff Timmerman, where we see such I'll just read the quote. The choice of a husband is not only the choice of the Romani woman learns to live with. Learns to live without. It is merely the first in a long series of repressions defining the wife-spousal role. Roma women are relegated to performing household duties, and it is not uncommon for a husband to forbid his wife from leaving the home. Paradoxically, Roma women see nothing unfair about mandatory spousal roles. Quite the opposite. They had the comfort of having a clear role in the world of unemployment without end. The men, jobless and bored, looked the worse off. And here's an example of an academic study which has a very specific tone to it, and it paints a very specific picture of Roma women and of the Roma community. Oops. To challenge such examples of opaque viewpoints, dialogic feminism lends itself to benefiting science, and it was first considered by Lígia in 2001 and situates itself in the third wave, which extends to the 1990s to present. Puigvert's concept of the other women is underpinned by other sociologists like Habermas, Castells, Giddens, Beck, Ferrer, Fletcher, and many others, and is grounded in dialogic learning that de Botton, Puigvert, and Sanchez Aroca have identified, that the other women, quote, are non-academic women who were silenced and have remained outside of spaces for public debates about women. It was first time that feminist theory included the voices of the other women, marking a shift in feminist discourse. We see that Romani feminism has included multiple voices, and Bitu and Vince identified that the main topics around Roma feminist discourse has developed to include forced sterilization, early marriages, prostitution, human trafficking, begging, and many other topics. Roma women suffer from marginalization in education and very high unemployment rates, and few participate in political processes. Sordi and Marti has suggested that as Roma women develop these dialogical relations in schools, they move from being dismissed to becoming the driving force behind the change. Alexandra Oprea, a well-recognized Roma woman and scholar, has largely reflected on the issue of child marriage, denouncing how the majority perceives these oppressive practices as a tribute to a primitive culture, but totally ignoring the role played by racism and demonizing minority cultures. As she states, this type of cultural approach needs to be overcome in order to really tackle this human right concern. Oprea has advocated for an analysis of social problems and has insisted that these issues be examined from the bottom up through looking at experiences of those who are marginalized and multi-burden. As Oprea and Romani feminism has started to outline, we see that many are making a case through science, that being underpinned by science, that grassroots Roma women are the driving force and have a space within Romani feminism. Nicoletta, another Roma woman and feminist, quotes, "My aim as a Romani feminist is to contribute to the construction of the modern Roma identity, one that considers diversity and equality within Roma communities and that addresses all the problems Roma women are subjected to at the intersection of gender, ethnicity, and class, and so on. I was shocked by the lack of sensitivity towards diversity and inequality among women, and even more so by the presence of racism among some European feminists. For these reasons, we recently proposed a European platform of Romani women that will act independently and avoid being the client of anyone. We want to function differently, and we will not wait for funds or requests from anyone before acting." As we start to see, there is an agency from Romani feminists from various profiles taking and moving feminism forward. It's not only feminist theory and academic spaces that are being transformed by this novel concept of Romani feminism, but also social spheres that have adapted this way of thinking and working. Among these is the Roma Association of Women, the Mokhtar, which translates as a road for freedom. This organization was created in 1999 by a group of Roma women and non-Roma women from different ages, academic backgrounds, professional profiles, and socioeconomic levels who pursued a common objective, which is to struggle for the equality and non-discrimination of the Roma women by promoting their participation in educational, social, and cultural spaces. The Roma Women's Association was among the first to consider the voices of the other women and created dialogic spaces where women from various backgrounds could come and participate and be active agents of change in their social, cultural, and political environments. Their work has been recognized by the European Commission, earning them several awards. One that's highlighted today is the Gold Award for the Best Grundtvig Project. In addition to many of the activities and EU projects that they carry out, they are empowering Roma women and achieving public recognition and prestige at local and European levels. They bring forward the voices of the grassroots Romani women and specific working approach to more spaces where there can be debate and a celebration of gender equality and plurality of voices. There is a need to rebuild and establish a new feminism that includes the plurality of voices that exist in our democratic society. The feminism of the 21st century is one that is malleable and able to reflect the diversity of women and their realities. As Bitu and Vince have claimed that feminism has the potential to transcend ethnic boundaries and must challenge binaries that maintain nationalist and racist regimes and patriarchal gender orders. Sanchez, Juste, Deboton, and Kostic suggest that Roma women are the active agents and main protagonists of transforming the lives in dialogical spaces. What you see here are images from various events that the Dromkotar Mestipen have organized. And the saying goes, a picture is worth 1,000 words, but I think you can really see the various profiles and the diversity of the women. Specifically, the Dromkotar occupies a space in Europe and positions itself to support a number of organizations. The international congresses that the organization has organized, which have been two in 2018 and in 2010 and in 2018, have brought together Roma women, over 300 Roma women from various countries. And in those congresses, they've overcome stereotypes about Romani feminism, The discussions have included overcoming absenteeism, early school leaving, expressing that Romani people and Romani women do care about education, to present new academic role models. And at each of these events, the presentations are grounded in evidence that are been scientifically proven. And so it's not people's opinions, but it's projects, and it's using and underpinned by science. The congresses, both the 2010 and 2018 events, were integral in better understanding not only the Mokhtar's work, but also highlighting that anti-Gypsyism is real, but offering solutions to those situations. One woman said, "I saw that it was possible. It was the first time I heard about such a thing. And then I also saw the strength that it was to be together among other Roma women. I had not become so aware of this, and it has also impacted me because I became aware of the diversity that was among us. We were very different at the same time. There were many things that brought us together. I want to say that to see women who have struggled so much in their daily lives, others who studied or were the university women in other official positions, jobs with many responsibilities, well, all this I had not experienced before, and I think this is what impacted me the most, is to realize that it was possible." The Mokhtar works and collaborates with several organizations throughout Europe. This is Amalipe, that is based in Bulgaria, and again, it aligns its collaborators working in the same way, where science is underpinning the work of the community. These are just slides from the various congresses. Here we have an elder woman who says, you can always learn something. You can, and then you can share it with your own children or with your grandchildren. We have to be ambitious. Another young Roma woman from Eastern Europe explaining her feelings. This was an image of the 2018 Congress. At this Congress, we had over 375 Roma women from 16 different European countries, international countries. In summary, the International Congress of Roma Women has looked at the power of narratives, the cultural intelligence, that everyone has a say. It's created solidarity networks guiding Romani women's relationships, a diversity of members' background, focusing on what works, and also eradicating discrimination through successful base rationale or emancipatory-oriented approach. And so, in conclusion, here are just more examples of other women. So in conclusion, Judith Butler suggests that there is something risky and true in claiming that women and socially disadvantaged women are vulnerable. If looking specifically at Roma women, there is research that shows that in-depth intersectional discrimination that the community faces can be classified in the following way: for being Roma women, socially economically disadvantaged persons, and for being people with low educational levels. In conclusion, an attention to context enables sociologists to create compelling narratives about the realities that we are working within. For example, thinking and opening up our viewpoints and being inclusive and removing the opaque lens can help us look at current topics like COVID, the Holocaust, political context, Afghanistan, and many other current issues. If we remove our opaque lenses, we generate science that is inclusive of all members of society and thus have a greater impact. And I just want to say this last comment: through the removal of opaque lenses allows us as sociologists to change the blueprints, to erect architecture and structures where the agency of humans produces and enhances science. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think I'm having some problems with sound. Maybe, are you listening? Yes, no, I think I have. So thank you very much, Professor Cisneros, for the wonderful speech. Now I'll give the word to Professor Mokhtar Harras from the Mohammed University in Rabat, Morocco. Professor Harras was a scientific committee member of the program 50 Years of Human Development in Morocco. Currently, he is a member of the Esperis Tamuda Review Board. He's also a member of the Board of Trustees of the Arab Council for the Social Sciences and assumes the co-coordination of the Fatema Mernissi chair. He was an active member in many national and international research projects and programs. He's the author of numerous articles and book chapters on rural development, rural women, youth, family, international and transnational migration, qualitative methods in social sciences, media sociology, public space, and the image of the other. Among the books published are Tribe and Power in Northern Morocco, Fertility and Culture, Women in Decision-Taking Positions, Youth, and Media in Morocco. So thank you very much, Professor Harras, for being here with us. I will now give you the word.
Thank you very much, Professor Lígia Ferro. I hope I'm pronouncing well your name. And thank you very much to ESA for inviting me to this important, very important conference. The title of my speech is Time and Liminality in Migration Context. As you know, time plays a vital role in generating and reproducing communities. Generally, we can define it as a common norm, as a perspective that has the same significance for all the people. We know that Newton has defined time as a linear process, which is abstract, absolute, divisible, composed of equivalent units, mechanical, etc. And we know also that Henry Bergson has emphasized the psychological and social aspects of time. Time is something that humans live with, is something that is embedded in human behavior, in human relationship, etc. So there is the clock time and there is also the social time. It's the fact of spending time together that engender and reinforce feeling of belonging. The maintenance of social ties and social cohesion require temporal synchronism. The transformation of organic time into mechanical time led to putting social life under control. The emergence of new technologies, notably transport of people and goods, besides the new technologies of information, is generating quick information transmission and at the right time. It engenders simultaneity. This is new. Time-space convergence and condensation, and help to make a shift from a clock time of modernity to the instantaneous time of post-modernity era. In industrial organizations, clock time has been associated with commodification, with work discipline and machine time. This view, in management studies, the essential question is how could we manage ourselves in order to be able to take control of the amount of time that is at our disposal. How to manage time in an effective and productive way. We need to manage time before it manages us. This was the recommendation of the specialist in management. Within organizations, there is the notion of temporal structuring. That reproduce or change temporal structure that shape individual activities. So there is the notion of temporal structures, and there is the individual behaviors. So temporal structures determine and shape individual temporal behaviors, but individual temporal behaviors do create and shape the temporal structures. So there is a sort of interdependence, inter-influence between temporal structures and individual practices. So there are some researchers who talk about objective time. Others talk about subjective time, but I think it's we have to talk rather about the practice-based perspective, which unify the objective and the subjective notions of time. The complexity of time only appears, as Barbara Adams says, when we distinguish between time, temporality, tempo, and timing. Between process, change, continuity, and temporal modalities. Between clock time, chronology, social time, and time consciousness, and between past, present, and future. Time structures, since time is produced and created, we should acknowledge its plurality of time. Or in terms of Novotny, society's pluritemporalism. Temporalities are also political and shape social inequalities. The state exerts its authority through temporal norms by activating political time, juridical time, and bureaucratic time. He imposes on unwanted populations the condition of permanent temporariness to prevent them from planning a future. In other words, temporalities are a sort of immaterial infrastructures that underlie and powerfully shape current forms of social organization and interaction. It means that time reflects, but above all, time affects, enables, constrains, and preconfigures contemporary urban life. Time includes or excludes and produce or reproduce urban inequalities. Despite this way of everyday life, time remains underappreciated and underused as a unit of social analysis. Is under-theorized, in other terms. Crossing the border. Could we see border crossing as travel in time as space that creates not only different locations, but also different past and future for those left behind at home and immigrants as well. So crossing border is not only geographical, but is also temporal crossing. Borders do not constitute a mere spatial and political demarcations between citizens and non-citizens, but opens new time options, confer time of freedom as well as time of insecurity and uncertainty to the migrants. They represent also temporal boundaries. Temporal boundaries are conflicting cultures of time and different modes of conceiving time and space. Time is an important tool of border control and migration management. It represents a strong preemptive border barrier that deter many migrants' crossings. Its effects become even stronger when paired with long periods of waiting and uncertainty. As long as the powerful is he who makes people wait. Migrants who find themselves constantly obliged to wait are living, in fact, in powerlessness, unpredictability, and lack of anticipation. They just endeavor to kill and pass their empty time, empty between brackets, empty time. Migrants who have crossed the border face multiple temporal regimes. Coping with this complex situation is as much vital in their daily life as securing income. Contrary to spatial and administrative border crossing, which may be fulfilled in a short time, social and cultural crossing may extend along the whole life, or even extend to the subsequent generations. Even when they find work and buy a house, they don't succeed in overcoming their status as liminal outsiders, lacking not only spatial, but also temporal integration into the host society. The time space they inhabit is the one that is in the interstices of the dominant and hegemonic temporal regime. Simultaneously, most of the migrants' responses tend to keep the continuities that link them to their family and country of origin. They even readapt themselves as far as possible with the temporal context of their country of origin. Far from being just geographical, border crossing relates to time by all other political, social, biological, and cultural dimensions. Time is within all of them. It gets broadly politicized when crossing the border to another country, even of the same continent. It results in the loss of shared experiences and perspectives between migrants and those who they left behind. They also result in changing conceptions and practices of family time and individual life course. These facts may have dire consequences for the continuity of the relations between immigrants and those who did not move. Migration is a turning point that implies taking up new roles with a new spatial and temporal context. It is a major biographical event that generates disorder in time managing, a shift in temporal objectives, constraints, and possibilities. Migrants have a unique and very specific time, livelihood, and configurations. What kind of factors could be behind migrants' perceptions of time? To what extent do factors such as temporal culture, delimited time visas, delimited time contracts, and nostalgia affect the migrant experience of time in the country of residence? We should recognize that in relation to migration, time has been under-theorized. Different types of time have been identified. A time that is long and slow, sticky time. Stagnant or suspended time, a time that accelerates to the point of becoming out of control, frenzied time, and ruptured time. In a modern capitalist society where time constantly accelerates, few researchers have produced writings about slowness, waiting, and queuing, especially in relation to migration. The changes that happen, it's also worthy to mention, that's the changes that happen in the immigration system suddenly and without warning remain understudied. However, these experiences of time show that migrant lives may be subject of disruption, not only by rapid change, but also by stagnation and absence of change. It results in a frenzied time that leave no time of control to the migrants, disempowering them. A number of researchers conceptualize time as an arrow, and emphasize time linear processes in relation to migration, seen as a process encompassing certain main steps, such as decision-making, journey, settlement, and eventually citizenship. According to this view, the processual nature of migration temporality is implicitly recognized. This mode of analysis goes in the direction of Heraclitus' thought that one can never step into the same river. A number of researchers in migration field present cyclical time as an alternative to linear time, confirming the reemergence of Nietzsche's eternal recurrence. This is the case in institutionalized schedules, habitual routines, collective synchronicities, and serialized time spaces. It's also the case in diverse types of seasonal mobility contexts, such as tourism, agriculture, and education. Here too, there is cyclical time. Migration journeys rarely follow a linear trajectory. In several cases, number of migrants found themselves stuck in a transit country and could not conform to this linear expectations. Many of them had to convert a transit country into their final destination. It's the case of Morocco with the sub-Saharan African immigrants. Some others had to repeat sections of their journeys following deportation or discovering of new opportunities, cyclical times. Frequently, the return can also lead to new beginning. Other temporal aspects could also be mentioned here. It's worth noting that speed and order apply differently to migrants' time sequences, in a sense that migrants go through fast movement of time to periods of stasis while in detention or waiting for money, favorable weather to boat taking, etc. Nowadays, migration occurs in a higher speed than previously and through long distances. In fact, a journey spans a diversity of temporalities and thus cannot be reduced to travel time. It includes waiting, accelerating, queuing, being still, stopping, repeating, etc. Past, present, and future are folded together. Even though migrants are daily confronted with present constraints, their lives are informed by the past and they are oriented towards the future. When confronted to an overwhelming social change, they draw on the past and nostalgia to consolidate the group identity. Migrants understand the present by reference to its use value for the future. Despite the difficulties that migrants face in the present, this orientation towards the future confers to them the capacity to bear the sufferings they are confronting in the present. Obviously, migration provides the possibility to experiment diversity of temporal rhythms, different processes in time change, but it also becomes the target of control policies of migrant time regulations relative to status, residence, and duration of stay. It permits to the migrant to be involved in multiple time cultures. Many of them live in a permanent fear of seeing themselves sent back to their countries of origin or departure. Migrants feel unfamiliar and distrustful vis-à-vis the host country's temporalities and all that is related to sequences, frequencies, activities duration, rhythms, norms of punctuality, memory work, continuities, discontinuities, synchronization of activities, priorities, day and night perceptions, etc., become a source of difference and conflicts with the host society. Besides this, unpredictability and lack of control results in migrants' incapacity to imagine even the near future. Undoubtedly, these discordant temporalities do have disruptive effects on migrants who increasingly face the challenge of transiting from one time to another and experience the tensions and difficulties of temporal coordination. As marginalized beings from mainstream societies, they confront temporal disjuncture and disharmony between their expectations and reality. Several migrants do experience temporal interruptions in their life course. Liminality. Mostly, migration implies a liminal period of waiting in border posts, at embassies and migratory offices in order to regulate legally the duration of stay or to transit to another country. Many researchers have noted that with waiting in a queue comes feelings of powerlessness and vulnerability. At this level, the concept of rite de passage seems suitable because everyone involved is in liminal phase between his actual situation and an objective to attain. Is also liminal in terms of physical space, as he stays in a legal no man's land between home country and the country of residence and the country of destination. In fact, he's in an interstructural period between structure and anti-structure, where both despair and hope are felt by the waiting migrant. Moreover, every end to waiting may be perpetuated by the start of a new waiting. Yet migrants may be authorized to cross the border and have a legal status, but the reduced access to work, education, marriage, and decent housing impose on him to remain in a liminal situation, in between its lack of integration and aspirations to what could never happen. Border crossing constitutes a threshold to access to new temporal space. It entails a potential of disorder. The resulting liminal status of migrants could be transitory when they are in the process of putting their roots in the host society, but also durable if they fail to integrate and thus remain neither from here nor from there. Moreover, the duration of a liminal period is unknown. It can last for a moment, a longer period or an epoch, and the in-between state is characterized by indeterminacy, ambiguity, and hybridity. However, even though this liminal sphere seems full of constraints and uncertainties, it can also be a knowledge productive space that generates new forms of cultural meanings. It appears also that the more free time migrants have, the more their social and ethnic status is less. It's the case of detainees and marginalized migrants who have neither work nor education. They have too much time that they feel abnormal in comparison to mainstream society, and probably also in an enforced idleness. They feel stuck and in limbo periods that can last indefinitely. Migrants who find themselves in this situation may feel shameful and excluded, or in a liminal phase where they feel liberated from familial, religious, and social expectations and pressures. Temporary labor migrants' time is generally under state control. It's the states who determine the time of their entry, exit, return, or their stay extension. They should regularly apply and wait for time to get a visa, time to enter a country, time to work, time to leave. Their life as immigrants depends on the time that is granted to them by the host state, in a sense that is largely governed and punished through various forms of seized time. It's worth noting that some employers, including public agents, control migrants through their work time use, spanning the length of period in job, the impact of working time on retention length of stay and changing immigration status. Employers tend also to confine migrant workers to some specific time spaces that are not likely to be acceptable by local citizens. This is the case of jobs whose time is uncertain or whose continuation could be neither guaranteed nor regular. Time is an accurate revealing of precarious migrants' working conditions. It goes from long hours to shift work, multiple jobs, and nighttime work. I don't know, I think I don't have much time, Lígia. Should I stop?
You have 2 minutes more.
So I'm just in the middle of my paper. So I think it's there is also other things like the night rates on the migrants' homes. There is also the migrant reactions to these measures and the procedures. There are many migrant reactions to this situation, and there is also the question of detention, migrant detention and deportation in some countries such as South Africa and some European countries as well. And in this detention, there is the problem of indeterminacy of time. The migrants don't know how long they would be detained in these detention centers. So the bad enemy, the worst enemy of the migrants, they say, is not to know when they would be released, when they would be deported. This is so while they are in this detention center, they feel that their life is timeless. They have no time. They try to kill time, to pass time, and they feel unable to think about the future, unable to plan anything. And I think this is I think it's just is putting on the table an issue of human rights. I think this question of time is also a human rights issue, and I think this is one conclusion of this one main conclusion of this paper. I think the states should deal and the NGOs should deal with this situation from the angle of human rights values and human rights norms. And I think it's in this issue, I think the research is just beginning. I think there are few studies on the question of time and migration and liminality. And I think we need much more studies on this. We need much more case studies in different parts of the world, because we cannot have a general picture on this. I think there is a lot of variation, a lot of diversity in this issue. And we need to cut this variation or this diversity to know more deeply and more precisely how time is another suffering that the migrants bear in the countries of destinations. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Professor Harras. Just one brief comment to all the participants in this session. Please feel free to write your questions in the chat for the discussion. And now it's time to hear Professor Thomas Faist from the University of Bielefeld in Germany. He received his PhD degree from the New School for Social Research, and he's a professor of transnational migration and development sociology. He directs the Center on Migration, Citizenship and Development, has contributed to ongoing debates about citizenship, transnationality, migration and social policy in Europe and beyond. He has authored and co-authored numerous books, including The Transnationalized Social Question, Migration and the Politics of Social Inequalities in the 21st Century, Disentangling Migration and Climate Change, Transnational Migration, as well as Citizenship, Discourse, Theory and Transnational Prospects, Dual Citizenship in Europe. So Thomas Faist is a member of the North Rhine-Westphalian Academy of Sciences, Humanities and the Arts. And we have the pleasure to have Professor Faist with us today. Thank you very much for accepting this invitation. The floor is yours.
Okay. Thank you, Professor Ferro, for your kind words of introduction. And thank you for having me to contribute to this panel. Let me try to share my presentation. I hope you can all see it.
Yes.
Okay. Now, tonight, I would like to talk about the social question and an aspect, a particular aspect of the social question, exit. By social question, I mean the politics around and the politicization of social inequalities. And migration is a strategic research site for the social question because migration is, among other things, a response to social inequalities. Now, you could say migration, the response is exit, but nonetheless, there are other responses to the vagaries created by mobility and by discrimination, such as voice. And Rosamaria Cisneros has already talked a lot about voice as a very distinct response to combating social inequalities. Now, my argument, which I want to make, is that it's not exit or voice, as it's often portrayed, but that if we look at today's social question on the 21st century, it is really voice accompanying exit that characterizes migration. But let's start with first things. We are all familiar, of course, with the opening lines of the Communist Manifesto by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, where they say, a specter is haunting Europe, the specter of communism. It's a very clear call to voice. It's a clear call to action to the proletarians who should topple the capitalist system. Now, it gets interesting, however, when we look at today's social question. Among other things, among other people, Branko Milanovic, formerly working at the World Bank, claims that we're living in a post-Marxian world, that it's not voice which is really the best, the most plausible option, but exit. And of course, voice and exit is taken from Albert Hirschman's triad. But nonetheless, when we talk about exit and migration, we should always be aware, of course, that exit is not the only option to declining living conditions, for example. Loyalty is high. Migration rates globally, as we know, are around 3.6%. But let's look at the case for exit trumping voice. When we look at global income distribution around the world and compare the years 1870 and 2000, that's what Branko Milanovic did, he found that in 1870, an individual's income anywhere in the world was explained to 50% or accounted for to about 50% by his or her class position, being a proletarian or a bourgeois. And only about 10 to 20% of the income was explained by the place, by the country someone was living. Now, this ratio has completely been turned around in the year 2000, when class only accounts for about 20 to 25% of the variance, and location is the dominant factor here. So there must be something about exit which has become more attractive, so to speak, and perhaps detrimental to voice. But has exit really trumped voice? And what are the implications for social change? At the surface, for example, when we look at the politics of migration and the politics of migration and inequalities, it seems that exploitation has been followed by exclusion, that we're talking less in public debates and in academic debates about class, more about status and culture, and that we're more concerned nowadays with recognition than only with redistribution. But it may not be an either-or choice. You get that preliminary conclusion from Hart and Negri's book Multitude, where they argue that it's, and famously saying, a specter haunts the world, and it is the specter of migration. So they imply, so to speak, that the proletariat has been followed by migrants and minorities as those expressing voice. Now, I'm exaggerating their point, of course. But I think it is very important to keep looking at exit and voice together. The question I want to look at tonight is, what are the implications of exit for voice? What about the implications for the political cleavages, not only for migrants' action, but also for politics in the political sphere, in the public sphere? And just to recapitulate what I just mentioned, namely that the social question originally in the 19th century referred to unsustainable inequalities in the process of capitalist industrialization all around the world, and that class conflict was its main expression. But that today's inequalities run along manifold heterogeneities, both in public debates and in academic research, in addition to class around gender, religion, ethnicity, nationality, age, sexual orientation, and several more, definitely. And what is today's social question, if you look at it as a question also of migration, is a thoroughly transnationalized social question. Migration is not only a transnational strategic research side, it's also important because we can discern transnational life worlds, both of migrants, but sometimes also of non-migrants who keep in touch with people from abroad. But there's a conundrum involved when we look at voice and exit. Namely, there are these transnational social spaces, or you could call them also social fields, and that what Mokhtar Harras has called simultaneity is existing. But political decision-making and a lot of politics is taking place in national public spheres. And that's why I think it's very important to take a look, not to jump to transnational analysis as such, but to look at the transnationalization also of national politics. And that's why I want to look for a moment at immigration puzzles and emigration puzzles. But before doing that, let me just briefly mention the main differences in the social question between the mid-19th century, the late 19th century on the one hand, and the 21st century on the other hand. 4 differences at the very least. First of all, in contrast to the mid-19th century, you nowadays have in what's called the global north, something of a welfare state in various incarnations. And in what's called the global south, the developmental state. Both the welfare state and the developmental state are built on economic growth and certain forms of redistribution. But they imply, both of them imply, closely controlled borders to avoid competition to the in the case of the welfare state, and excessive brain drain in the case of the developmental state. And it's not wage competition I'm talking about, but the products of open borders would be a challenge to institutional setups in welfare states. Namely, entrepreneurs would not negotiate anymore with unions, for example. So second, nowadays, we see much more effective migration control. We see externalization of European countries or the European Union institutions in regions like North, West, East Africa, for example. We see high-tech surveillance and the implications, what Mokhtar has been talking about in terms of time, in making journeys, in making migration experiences, for example, as a permanent, turning them into permanent temporariness. third difference is that we find an increasing culturalization of politics. It's not that class is devoid of culture. That would be nonsense, of course. It is part and parcel of culture. But with the advent of the new social movements in the 1970s, for example, there is much more emphasis in political action on issues of recognition. And its antagonist, also more emphasis on issues of cultural homogeneity, which is allegedly threatened by mobility. And the fourth difference is that there is nowadays no dominant social theory inspiring political mobilization around inequalities. In the 19th century, it was socialist brands, for example, anarchism, Marxist theory, and increasingly also feminist thinking. But nowadays, the panoply of these theory has widened considerably. So these are four differences, but let us turn to the immigration puzzles now. In a simple 2x2 table, and take a look at what does this imply for voice? What does exit and entry imply for voice? You have two dimensions. The vertical dimension is immigration policies. Are they expansive or more open, or are they more restrictive? And on the horizontal dimension, I simply divide between the economic realm. Are migrants economically wanted? That refers to the welfare puzzle. And or are migrants culturally welcome? That refers to the rule of law puzzle. From a market liberal point of view, migrants and others laborers are simply human capital, right? That's an aspect of the competition state. And opposed to that, in contradistinction, is the welfare state's principle of regulated commodification, turning human beings into wage laborers, so to cushion somewhat against the risks of capitalist production and decommodification. And the welfare state is a very ambiguous animal because it is exclusive towards the outside, exclusive to those who are not yet there. But it's inclusive to those, and that includes migrants, once they reach the territory. Although there are great differences, think of irregular migrants who have no claims usually to welfare right, to social rights. But here it's the first kind of, we see already that migrants, when we look at all the literature, all the research results we have, that migrants are very important part and parcel of struggles in the workplace. Think, for example, of the wildcat strikes among labor migrants in Western Europe in the early 1970s. Think of strikes and workouts and walkouts and other forms of collective action. So this is the first kind of puzzle, the welfare puzzle, where you have certain principles of the competition versus the welfare state. The kind of analysis needs, of course, to include whether or not migrants are culturally welcome or not. From a cultural pluralist point of view, yes, the answer. And it builds on the rights revolution, where not only citizens, but all humans should enjoy human rights and partly cultural rights. And it includes humanitarian and other obligations towards refugees. And it's an outcome which is compatible with the rule of law principles, usually. Opposed to that, and in this realm is where we find a lot of migrant struggles, a lot of migrant voice. In the 70s, it was around class, in the 80s and 90s around ethnicity, and nowadays often now around religion and the institutionalization of new religions in Europe, for example, around Islam. Now, that kind of development is contradicted very strongly by what could be called the national democratic state perspective, namely that it's not diversity, but it's national cultural homogeneity which is at stake and which could be threatened by migration. And sometimes this even leads to securitized policies, and here we're back to the externalization perspective I mentioned before, namely considering migrants as risks and threats. And even in the age of climate change, you find debates in Western European states, at the very least, which consider migrants as an ecological burden, not only as a terrorist threat, not only as a threat to democracy, not only as a threat to Christian religion, but also a threat to the ecological carrying capacity of states. And this is a continuation of post-colonial intrusion, so to speak, when you think of sterilization campaigns which Western countries conducted in regions of China and India in the 1970s. So here we have the rule of law puzzle, where the rule of law is pitted against the national state. And when you look at immigration puzzles, and here I want to be a bit shorter, you have kind of the mirror image of immigration puzzles. In a market liberal point of view, immigrants are remittance providers, they're carriers of human capital, and they're investors. They're regarded as brain gain. And that's the typical view of the competition state, market liberal. The national development perspective, which is the mirror image of the welfare state, so to speak, it emphasizes national resources and their development. For example, avoiding the high costs of highly skilled workers. And nonetheless, as the welfare state is ambiguous, it is against, of course, pitted against brain drain, but it is, of course, it welcomes transfers such as remittances. Where voice is, and here you do already have voice coming in those migrant organizations who are active from abroad in collective remittances to contribute to the development of, or you could use other words, of course, of their regions of origin. Now, that's the development puzzle. The national puzzle, in a way, is between emigration and diaspora as assets, that the global nation, a transnational state, and immigrants and diaspora as a threat from the point of view of the national security state. And I don't think I need to mention a lot of examples. Think of the Tamil Tigers in the case of Sri Lanka, which really led to a bloody war for a very long time. But what are the implications for politics? Let me just go back to the immigration puzzles. What you see and why this is interesting, it's not that academics enjoy puzzles. It has very practical implications for politics. Namely, you find strange bedfellows, in the words of Ari Zolberg. Namely, on the expansive side, on the more open side, you have both market liberals and cultural pluralists who usually don't go together, and their worldviews and ideologies are strictly diverging. And on the more restrictive sides, you also have strange bedfellows pushing in the same direction without entering in explicit coalitions. Namely, those proponents of the welfare state, like labor unions, for example, but also cultural conservatives who would see, or even right-wing populists or right-wing extremists who would see migration as a dire threat, not only to democracy, but to one's way of life. But I think the dynamics we see in politics comes out of something else. So this is kind of a negative description in terms of the political possibilities for political coalitions. But what is more interesting is, again, the position of the welfare state, because the welfare state, as I said, is an ambiguous animal. You find in the welfare state both exclusionary and inclusionary tendencies. Exclusionary towards those who have not yet entered the territory, more inclusionary towards those who are there. And that's why I think that this diagonal line, welfare state, rule of law, and the political coalitions, that's where you usually find also migrants and migrants activism, and you find potential for policies which, you know, look at exit and voice in a more dialogical fashion. So in a way, we could say that as a preliminary answer to the question I posed before, that it's not that status and culture have replaced class, but they have complemented class. And this is not only a development we see with respect to migrants and minority groups, or the classic case would be diaspora, but we also see it with manifold social movements. Now, what do we do with all of this? What are the implications, so to speak, for exit and voice of this kind of heuristic of migration politics in both immigration states and emigration states? Now, Borders and boundaries, borders between states, boundaries between groups document the social inequalities. One of the examples I mentioned was the social inequalities as belabored by the rights revolution on the one hand versus securitized and culturalized debates on the other hand. And I think that in order to get beyond the dichotomy of exit and voice, it's very helpful to start with a socio-philosophical consideration with one of those considerations by Georg Simmel, who conceived human beings as quintessential border figures. And how to imagine that when you look at it from a collective point of view, not an individualized one. Simmel really describes how borders connect what is separated and separate what is connected. Think of it, of the first, borders connect what is separated. A good example would be the transnational social spaces I mentioned before, formed by migrants and non-migrants, formed by a whole migration industry or a rescue industry in the case of refugees. But borders also separate what is connected, namely states through migration control, such as externalization or remote control, do separate such spaces and turn migrants into waiting, alter their lives completely in a way. So what is the implication of such an understanding of border? In such an understanding of border, there must be some cross traffic of not only of goods, capital, services, but also of humans. The walls we see proliferating, we have seen proliferating since the early 1990s when we had about a dozen walls between states to about 70 or 80 nowadays. That suggests that there is not only increasing restrictionism, that suggests that these are not borders at all. These are not borders in any conceivable logical sense or plausible sense. Walls are not borders. And because borders do allow, I think, for the possibility of coexistence of different entities. This could be states. They allow for the coexistence of different entities called groups. Then we talk about boundaries. And of course, and that's why you could say, well, this is very utopian. What should we do with it? It's just pie in the sky thinking. An equal status is necessary. And of course, that's usually not given when you think of European African migration movements from Europe to Africa, but especially from African countries to Europe, although migration to Europe is not the majority of migration in and from Africa. When you look at that, you can easily see that there is no equal status, that there all the power asymmetry is possible. Now, nonetheless, I would say that we can use this understanding of border in order to gain a better understanding of how exit can be molded by voice. So it's not exit versus voice in the sense of Marx and Milanovic I'm talking about, but the voice which is really necessary to make exit, to design exit, to fight for exit in a way which corresponds, for example, to human rights. And when we look at the current institutional frameworks, the Geneva Convention for Refugees being a partial example, the global compacts, which have been concluded by the member states of the UN on migration and the other one on refugees in 2080, are sorely lacking, the voice of migrants. The voice of migrants is nowhere to be heard in the global compacts. It's a more technocratic approach with very good policies partly, but without those who are most concerned. And that's why I think it's worth really discussing alternative imaginings. Think, for example, of the book Refugia, or the idea of refugia by Robin Cohen and Nick Van Heer. They argue that you could think of refugee camps around the world in Europe, Asia, America, Africa, Oceania, and you could link them into a transnational polis, a polity, which is partly self-administered by the refugees themselves who have ID cards, and which is financed, for example, by remittances and other kinds of income. And the interesting question is about this proposal is, and I think it speaks for the proposal that it enables such questions, that it brings up such questions, is, you know, how can ethnic or national or religious differences or even conflicts be overcome so that refugees can think of a common identity? Or even further, or even more fundamental, in a critical perspective on this proposal of Refugia by Robin Cohen and Nick Van Heer, do refugees really want to be regarded as refugees? Aren't refugees also people who really want to be something else than refugees? And I think it speaks for the productivity of such utopian thinking that it enables us to raise these questions about borders, about delineations, delimitations of borders, and how voice could accompany exit and entry. Another possibility, which is not worked out, but which which is very clearly lacking, is a global migration parliament in which state, civil society, migrants are represented. I mean, there are lots of problems involved in such utopian ideas. You know, who should represent migrants, and who are migrants anyway? You know, who has a claim to be represented? But I think it could, you know, continue the work started in the Global Forum on Migration and Development, where you do have a representation of civil society, although sorely lacking when you compare it to the representation of states and certain parts of civil society, namely business. But I think also this idea of a global migration parliament is an idea which really is going beyond the conventional understanding of borders. And here I would say that it's not, when we talk about exit and entry, it's not open or closed borders which are helpful dichotomies. I think helpful concept, a much more helpful concept, would be the idea of negotiated borders. And even though this idea is not translatable, cannot be put into practice right away, I think this is what the task, I understand my task as a sociologist, to develop ideas which may have a utopian touch, but nonetheless help us to reevaluate the social question, today's social question, which is a migration social question partly, not only, but partly, and in which it's not exit or voice or exit dominant versus voice, but more than ever, I think, voice necessary to complement exit. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Faist, for this interesting talk. Well, we have some time for discussion. I have some questions here, and as we are like 15 minutes before the end of this session, I propose that I read some questions to you together. You can take some notes, and then you will have the floor to answer to some of these questions. So first, to Professor Rosamaria Cisneros from Tatiana Avelin. Thank you for your contribution. Can you please reflect on language use and agency of Roma people? Also from Daniela Cherubini to Professor Cisneros. Thank you very much for your talk, learning about grassroots Roma feminism, which you define as one of the key transformative forces in Europe in the last 30 years, has been inspiring. I would like to know more on its relationships with other feminisms and feminist movements in the Spanish context, as well as at the international level. Perhaps in terms of mutual acknowledgement or denial, share the issues or divisive points, examples of alliances. And the second question, also to Professor Cisneros, on the class background and composition of the Roma feminist organizations that you met in the field. Thank you very much. and to Professor El Harras. I have a lot of questions, so I'm trying to select. From Tatiana Avelin, thank you for your talk. While talking about time and borders, I wanted to bring up the subject of crossing borders via land and via air, where we can discover the profound differences and inequalities. I wanted to point your direction on the interesting book Waiting by Ghassan Ash. And also to Professor El Harras. You mentioned that liminality can be also productive. Could you please name some examples, elaborate on this more? More questions. Now to Professor Faist. I found Professor Feist's intervention very inspiring. I would like to ask him how much the conceptualization of social class from Bourdieu could resonate with that he's proposing. If I may, also to Professor Kostic Cisneros, I would like to say I found it very interesting and heuristical, useful, her analysis and the emphasis on activism. So for now, these are the questions. I will give you 5 minutes each. Is that okay? So you can organize also. Just one last question also to Professor Feist. How can we combine the perspectives of precaria and border figures by Standing and Zimmel while answering the new social question? The last question by Tatiana Avelin. So can we start with Professor Cisneros?
Hello, thank you. Thank you for the various questions, very big questions. So I will do my best to answer the three in a matter of minutes. The first question was around language use and agency of Roma people. In the context that I was referring to, languages, there were various languages, various Romani dialects that were spoken. However, that the beauty is that the egalitarian spaces transcends boundaries and linguistic barriers. So the communities were able to translate amongst themselves to support each other. And so while there were various differences among the Roma women that I've referenced and in the fieldwork that I've been looking at, those linguistic barriers are not in any way a barrier. They're seen actually as a transformative kind of celebration of the historical reality of the community living in various contexts. The second question was the relationship to feminist movement. There were various strands to this question, either alliances or divisive strands. So the Romani feminism sits within dialogic feminism, and so its dialogic feminism is an egalitarian way of working, and so it's inclusive of all voices. And in that work and in that mode of working, it has alliances and is welcoming of anyone. And you know, the point is that you don't need to be an academic. You can be any woman, particularly focusing on the other women, and that profile allows for a solidarity network to emerge. Indeed, this might challenge the way that perhaps traditional antiquated ways of doing feminism that was very specific, a very elite way of working. And so Romani feminism might, you could say, align itself with people and agency, and also is inclusive in challenging these ideas of elites speaking for community members. And it's not only, dialogic feminism doesn't only lend itself to the Roma community. That's the power, the transformative agency of it, that it lends itself to various communities from various walks of life. The third question was on the composition of Roma feminists in relation to the field. And so within the work that I've referenced today, it was again very diverse from many countries, and that composition is, you know, women, elder women, 80-year-old women that have never left their villages. You know, were coming to the congresses, were in some instances the first time they traveled by plane, and so that composition, that profile was varied. But in the conferences and in the work, that was the beauty, that there was a lifting and a celebration of each other, and so that the umbrella of diversity that is the Roma community was very much a part of the congresses and of the various activities that the Mokhtar carries out, but also the partners that the Mokhtar works alongside. So, and the last question I didn't catch, Lígia.
Well, I guess it was more kind of a comment.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Yes,
Okay.
so.
Okay, thank
Thank
you.
you very much. Thank you very
Thank
much.
you.
So please, Professor Harras. Sorry, you're muted.
The first question, I didn't hear it. I didn't understand it. The second question, is liminality productive? I think liminality could be productive and could be not productive. There is two possibilities. So it could be something permanent. The migrants could become liminal permanently. This is one possibility. Another possibility is that the liminal migrant, because he's far from home, the religious and the social and the familial links that impose on him to act in a certain way, to think in a certain way, etc. This doesn't exist in the country of residence. So he's relatively free to think, free to adopt some new kinds of behavior, to have new kinds of relationships, etc. So in this sense, it could be productive. On the other hand, the liminal migrants think about his situation, and he tries to cope and to readapt himself to the temporalities of the society of residence. He tries to integrate himself into the society of residence, the host society, and this leads him to produce new a culture that could be a kind of compromise, a culture that could have some new elements that help him to have a better relationship with the host society, etc. So it's that's why I said that liminality could be also culturally productive, because he doesn't remain exactly as he came from his country. He came with his temporal culture from his country of origin, but once he's in the host country, this culture evolves. This culture is getting developed to cope and to achieve adaptation to the host society culture. So the first question, I didn't understand it. I'm sorry.
It was a comment. It was more like a comment. Okay. Thank you very much. And Professor Faist, please.
Yes, as I understood it, the first question is about how the concepts such as the social class from Bourdieu chime in with my analysis. And I think that there are many elective affinities, and you could even rewrite what I said in Bourdieusian terms. It's not only the distinction, the division of fields, the economic field, the cultural field. It's also, I think, what Bourdieu could contribute to a more fine-grained analysis than I was able to present tonight, is the various capitals, the various resources migrants and non-migrants have available to express voice, starting including not only cultural capital, but also social capital and economic capital. And you see that in struggles around the workplace, with respect to social capital, struggles in the cultural sphere for religious recognition. And so I think that a Bourdieusian approach to voice in this realm could be and would be and will be, I think, very productive. So this understanding of class, which I started with, kind of an economic understanding of class, would be too short-sighted and too narrow in order to capture today's understanding of class, which Bourdieu has pushed ahead and has really contributed to a lot. The second question is about the precariat as border figures and how that fits into the new social question. Well, as I understand it, when we talk about the precariat in the sense of Guy Standing's work, for example, we talk about more permanent exclusion and the precariat being a product of the neoliberal market and world order. So we're not simply talking about disadvantaged workers. We're talking much more than that. And nonetheless, I think what's very important is the recognition, and this is we know from field studies in quite a few North American and European cities, that also those who would say, well, belong to the precariat as a category, as a classification, are certainly not lacking voice necessarily. The studies on undocumented migrants and their collective actions speak volumes about that. So that, for example, there is both voice, which is in the Bourdieusian sense, fed by their own capital, such as social capital, banding together with other undocumented migrants from similar regions or from other regions. But also, I think, in forming coalition with local partners. In the US, from ethnographic research, we do know that these coalitions usually emerge with civil rights organizations. In Europe, it's more likely to emerge with socialist organizations or labor unions. So I do think that precariat, in the sense of the border figures by Simmel, which I mentioned towards the end of my talk, is certainly something that at first sight you would say, well, we're not talking here about borders because exclusion is too thorough. But I think when we talk about the precariat, the idea of a border figure nonetheless makes sense to the extent that groups which we could classify as precariat do engage in collective action towards their betterment.
Well, thank you very much. We are on time. Thank you to Professor Cisneros, Harras, and Faist for sharing your ideas with us, and also to the participants in the session. Now it's time to close the session. We hope that you continue to enjoy the conference.